He was a man who had everything: wealth, power, and influence, but trusted no one. His life was carefully controlled, walled off from anyone who might hurt him. Then a nurse walked into his world, not with promises or flattery, but with compassion, patience, and kindness. And slowly, against all odds, this millionaire found his guarded heart opening in the most unexpected way. Damian Grayson's reputation preceded him wherever he went. In the business world, people spoke his name with equal parts admiration and caution. He had the instincts of a predator, the kind of man who could close a deal before his rivals even realized the game had begun. To his employees, he was demanding but fair-on executive who rewarded results but never gave away trust. To his competitors, he was ruthless, someone who never left weakness unexploited. And to the press, he was a mystery. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, his answers were clipped and rehearsed, offering nothing personal. It was always this way. As a boy, Damian had been lively and curious. His mother's laughter filled their house, her warmth softening even William Grayson's hard edges. Sunday mornings meant jazz records spinning on the turntable, pancakes sizzling in the kitchen, and the three of them sailing when the weather was fair. But when cancer stole his mother's light, everything changed. William, once strict but present, withdrew into his company and left Damian adrift. Grief was never spoken of. Emotions were treated like weaknesses. Damian quickly learned that showing vulnerability invited disappointment. By the time he finished business school, his father had hammered one lesson into him. People are driven by self-interest. Trust contracts, not promises, William used to say. Trust balance sheets, not words. Damian lived by those rules, and they worked. He built his own firm, amassed fortune and influence, and earned a reputation as someone untouchable. Yet at night, in his penthouse overlooking the city, success tasted hollow. He had the corner office, the cars, the private jet, but no one to share them with. His relationships were shallow, transactional. He didn't believe anyone could see past the wealth and find the man underneath. Then came the phone call that forced cracks into his carefully built walls. His father, William Grayson, the towering figure who had shaped him with silence and criticism, had collapsed in his study. A massive stroke left him frail, unable to walk, and barely able to speak. For the first time in his life, Damian was faced with something money couldn't fix. When William was admitted to Pine Haven Care Home, Damian insisted on the best doctors and the most advanced equipment. But he didn't plan to spend much time there himself. He thought of it as another responsibility, like a quarterly report that needed signing. Yet duty pulled him through those doors, and that's where he first glimpsed something he hadn't expected. The quiet, steadfast presence of a woman who treated his father not as a tycoon brought low, but as a human being still deserving of dignity. And it was in that moment that Damian's carefully fortified world began to shift. Sierra James had long since stopped expecting life to hand her anything easily. At 35, she had learned resilience the hard way. Losing her mother at 12 had left her with an emptiness only her grandmother could fill. That woman, stern but loving, had taught Sierra the value of perseverance. Work hard, keep your word, and treat everyone with kindness. The world may not repay you right away, but you'll sleep with a clear heart. Those words stayed with Sierra through every long night shift, every stretch of exhaustion, every moment she wondered if her efforts made a difference. Working at Pine Haven Care Home was demanding. The halls were lined with the quiet struggles of aging patients fighting illness, memory loss, loneliness. Many had families who rarely visited, leaving Sierra and the staff to provide not just care, but companionship. It was as glamorous work, and the pay barely covered her bills, but Sierra had never been one to measure value in dollars. For her, it was in the squeeze of a hand, the smile of a resident who remembered her name, the comfort she could provide in moments of fear. When William Grayson was admitted, most of the staff whispered about him. A shipping magnate, a billionaire, a man whose name was printed on skyscrapers and shipping vessels alike. But Sierra only saw an elderly man stripped of the armor of wealth, lying frail in a bed, frightened by a body that no longer obeyed him. While others treated him with cautious distance, she leaned in closer. She adjusted his blankets, told him about the weather, described the cherry blossoms blooming outside the window. She brought in jazz records, remembering a fleeting comment he'd made, and filled the sterile room with warmth. Her care wasn't clinical, it was personal. She smuggled in apple pie, not because it was on his diet sheet, but because she knew the smell might remind him of home. She read poetry, not because he asked, but because silence felt too heavy. And even when he couldn't respond, she talked to him as if he could. "You're still here," she would whisper. "And until you tell me otherwise, I'm going to treat you like you can hear every word." The doctors noticed subtle changes. William's eyes tracked her movements more often. His fingers twitched when she played music. His vitals steadied during her visits. Dr. Peterson admitted that while science couldn't quantify it, Sierra's presence mattered. But Sierra didn't think of it as extraordinary. To her, it was simply doing what she wished someone had done for her grandmother in her final days, seeing the person, not the illness. And it was during one of those quiet evenings, when Sierra was reading aloud from a worn book of poetry, that the door opened and Damian Grayson stepped inside. He expected to see a nurse checking vitals, charting numbers. Instead, he found a woman who spoke to his father with warmth and patience, as if the man lying in that bed was more than a fading tycoon. To Damian, it was confusing. To Sierra, it was nothing more than compassion. But that moment would mark the beginning of a story neither of them saw coming. The first time Damian and Sierra spoke, sparks didn't fly, it was tension, sharp and cold. Damian had walked into the room expecting to see his father alone or with medical staff hovering quietly, not a young woman reading poetry as though she belonged there. His suit was perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable, and his voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked, his tone clipped. Sierra closed the book gently, placing it on the table, and met his eyes without flinching. "I'm reading to your father," she said simply. Her calmness disarmed him. She wasn't apologetic, nor was she intimidated. "Is that part of your duties here?" His question carried an edge, as if searching for some flaw in her professionalism. "No," Sierra admitted, "but he responds to it. Music, stories, human voice. She engages more when there's connection. That's my duty, Mr. Grayson, not just to treat his illness, but to care for him as a person." Her words lingered in the air. Damian was used to people justifying themselves, scrambling to please him. Sierra did neither. She spoke with conviction, her gaze steady, her tone respectful but firm. For the first time in a long while, Damian didn't know how to respond. That night, he returned home unsettled. He told himself it was irritation that this nurse's aide was overstepping. But the image of her sitting by his father's bed, her voice steady and warm, reading poetry as if it mattered, replayed in his mind. He poured himself a drink in his penthouse, but the whiskey burned sharper than usual. For years, he had believed kindness was weakness. Yet here was someone proving him wrong, and it unnerved him. The next evening, he returned to Pinehaven. He told himself it was to check on his father's progress, but when he walked into the room, Sierra was there again. This time, she was playing a soft jazz record. His father's eyes were half closed, his hand twitching faintly in rhythm with the music. Damien stood in the doorway longer than he intended, watching. Sierra didn't notice him at first. She was focused on William, her lips moving quietly as she explained the music, as though guiding him back to memory. Damien stepped in finally, awkward, unfamiliar with the feeling of being the outsider in a room. "You like jazz?" he asked stiffly, not sure why he was making small talk. Sierra smiled faintly. "I do, but more importantly, your father does. He told me once that Sunday mornings used to start with this very record. I thought it might help him feel more at home." Damien looked at the record player, then at his father, whose chest rose and fell with steadier rhythm. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Something Sierra almost mistook for grief. But just as quickly, the mask returned. He didn't thank her. Instead, he sat in silence on the opposite side of the bed, watching his father, listening to the music, and stealing occasional glances at the woman who somehow made the sterile room feel less like a hospital and more like a home. As the weeks passed, William's progress was slow but undeniable. He could now open his eyes more frequently, and occasionally his lips formed slurred words. Dr. Peterson credited consistent therapy, but Damien knew Sierra's presence was equally vital. Every evening when he arrived after work, she was there, sometimes reading, sometimes humming softly, sometimes just sitting in silence with his father. At first, Damien's visits were stiff, limited to checking charts and asking the doctor direct questions. But Sierra's steady presence began to chip away at his reserve. One evening, she told him casually about a patient who had regained strength after months of barely moving. "The brain is stubborn," she explained. "It wants to find a way back, even when we think it can't." Damien found himself asking questions he never would have asked before. "What do you talk to him about? Do you think he hears you?" Sierra's answer was simple. "I talk about ordinary things. The weather, the staff gossip, what I made for dinner last night. And yes, I believe he hears. Maybe not every word, but the comfort of being spoken to it matters. It reminds him he's still here." For Damien, who had lived in a world of boardrooms and bottom lines, it was a revelation. He had always believed people responded only to leverage, incentives, power. But his father was responding to something far simpler. Care. Outside of Pine Haven, Damien's world continued to spin in chaos. Richard Hamilton and the board pushed aggressive deals, selling assets Damien believed were worth far more than the prices they accepted. He fought from the sidelines, his voice limited by legal constraints. At night, he buried himself in financial reports, but his thoughts drifted back to Sierra's calm voice, her patience, her unshakable belief that recovery was possible. Their conversation slowly shifted from his father to each other. At first, Damien asked small questions. "Do you always work such long shifts? Don't you ever get tired?" Sierra would answer lightly, then turn the question back on him. "And you? Do you ever stop working?" One evening, Sierra mentioned her dream of becoming a registered nurse, if only she could afford the schooling. Damien, who had never thought twice about tuition or opportunity, found himself struck silent. She lived in a world where every dollar mattered, where one broken-down car could derail her life. And yet, she carried herself with more grace than anyone he knew in his wealthy circles. For Sierra, Damien was equally puzzling. He was sharp, intimidating, and clearly powerful, but when he sat by his father's bed, she saw glimpses of a different man. He asked about old memories, about the records they used to play, about vacations long ago. Sometimes his voice broke when he thought no one noticed. Sierra noticed, and against her better judgment, she began to see him not as a cold millionaire, but as a son trying to reconnect with a father before it was too late. Their worlds could not have been more different. Damien lived in penthouses and boardrooms. Sierra lived in scrubs and small apartments. He wielded billions. She counted every paycheck. And yet, in the quiet of William's hospital room, none of that mattered. What mattered was the way William's eyes brightened when Sierra entered. What mattered was the way Damien's guarded expression softened when he listened to her, and slowly, impossibly, something fragile began to grow between them. It began with an invitation Damien never expected himself to extend. One afternoon, after another tense call with his father's board of directors, he found Sierra in the care home's small garden, watering a row of tomato plants planted by the residents. Her hair was tied back, wisps of curls escaping to catch the sunlight. She was humming under her breath, unaware he was watching. "Miss James," he called, his voice softer than usual. She turned, shading her eyes, and gave him a smile that seemed to cut through the weight he carried on his shoulders. "You're early today," she said. "I needed a break from the office." He hesitated, something unfamiliar tugging at him. "I was wondering if you'd have dinner with me sometime. Outside of here." Sierra blinked, caught off guard. "Dinner?" "Yes, just dinner. No business talk, no board meetings. Just—" He stopped, suddenly self-conscious. "Just us." She studied him carefully, her hand still damp from the watering can. "Damien, I don't think that's a good idea. You're my patient's son. It wouldn't feel professional." He expected rejection, but instead of walking away, she added quietly, "Still, I appreciate the offer." Her refusal stayed with him the entire evening. He told himself it was better this way. Lines shouldn't be crossed. But the truth was, he wanted to know her not as a nurse's aide, not as his father's caregiver, but as a woman who saw the world so differently from his own. A few days later, fate gave him another chance. Sierra was sitting in the staff lounge during her break, unwrapping a simple turkey sandwich from wax paper. He knocked on the doorframe before entering, holding a paper bag from an upscale deli. "I thought I'd trade you," he said, placing the bag on the table. "Homemade soup, fresh bread, and chocolate cake. I'll even share." Sierra raised an eyebrow. "Bribery?" "Negotiation," Damien countered, taking a seat across from her. Despite herself, Sierra laughed, and for the first time, they shared a meal not as nurse and family, but as two people learning each other's rhythms. He asked about her grandmother, about the years she spent juggling jobs to survive. She asked about his work, his ambitions, the crushing pressure of running companies worth billions. To both of their surprise, the conversation flowed easily. By the end of lunch, Damien knew he wanted more. "Next time," he said, gathering his empty soup container, "let's make it dinner. Somewhere nice. No scrubs, no suits even. Just us." Sierra hesitated, her heart torn between caution and curiosity. She had rules, boundaries she'd never broken. But there was something in his voice, a quiet sincerity that slipped past her defenses. "All right," she said softly. "One dinner." That night, Damien found himself smiling for no reason. The city lights outside his window brighter than they had looked in years. Their first official dinner wasn't in the kind of glittering restaurant Sierra expected. Instead, Damien drove her to a small Italian place by the harbor. The kind of restaurant his mother had once loved: checkered tablecloths, candles in wine bottles, the scent of garlic bread heavy in the air. "This is not what I imagined," Sierra admitted, looking around the cozy room. "Not fancy enough?" Damien teased, though there was nervousness in his tone. "No," she said quickly. "It's perfect." They sat by the window, overlooking the water. Damien ordered pasta for them both and a bottle of wine, and for a while, Sierra felt the lines between their worlds blur. He told stories of his mother teaching him to sail, of the summer the boat's engine failed, and they drifted for hours, laughing while his father fumed. Sierra shared stories of her grandmother teaching her to make soup from scraps, of nights spent studying by candlelight when the power was cut off. Somewhere between the first bite of pasta and the last sip of wine, the walls around Damien's heart began to crumble. He found himself speaking truths he'd buried for years. After my mother died, he confessed, his voice low, I tried to be what my father wanted. Cold, ambitious, focused only on success, and I got very good at it. Too good. He gave a humorless laugh. I built empires, but I lost everything else along the way. Sierra reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. It's never too late to change, she said softly. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. A promise? A possibility. Later, as he walked her to her apartment door, Damien hesitated. For a man who made billion-dollar decisions daily, the act of leaning closer to her felt impossibly daunting. At the last moment, he simply took her hand and pressed it gently before stepping back. Good night, Sierra. Good night, Damien. She closed the door, her heart pounding, knowing she was already in far deeper than she had intended. From that night onward, something shifted. Damien no longer came to Pinehaven out of obligation, but out of desire. He wanted to see her, to hear her laugh, to feel the calm she brought into every room. And Sierra, against all her better judgment, found herself waiting for him. His smile at the nurse's station made her cheeks warm. His late-night texts about books and music made her feel like a girl again, giddy and hopeful. William noticed, too. His voice was still weak, his sentences slurred, but one evening as Sierra adjusted his blanket, he looked between her and Damien and said hoarsely, About time. Damien chuckled. About time for what, Dad? To bring a good woman home. Sierra flushed crimson, but Damien only smiled, his eyes warm as they met hers. The invitation had been hanging in the air between them for weeks. Damien's company was hosting its annual charity gala, the kind of glittering event that graced magazine covers and society pages. It was less about charity and more about networking an opportunity for investors, politicians, and socialites to show their faces. For years, Damien had attended with carefully chosen companions, women who matched his status and polished image. This year, he asked Sierra. When the words left his mouth, even he wasn't sure what she would say. He knew it was asking her to step into his world where appearances mattered more than sincerity. But he wanted her there, by his side, even if it meant unsettling the fragile balance he'd begun to find. Sierra hesitated. The thought of walking into a ballroom filled with billionaires made her stomach twist. She didn't own gowns or glittering jewelry. Her world was scrubs and second-hand furniture. Damien, she said quietly, they'll expect you to arrive with someone like them, not someone like me. I don't care what they expect, he replied firmly. I want you there. She studied his face, the sincerity in his eyes. Against her fears, she found herself nodding. All right, I'll come. The night of the gala arrived. Sierra stood in front of her small mirror, smoothing the simple black gown she had saved months of wages to buy. It wasn't designer. It wasn't dripping in jewels. But when she looked at herself, she felt dignified. She clasped her mother's old silver necklace around her neck, the only heirloom she had, and whispered to her reflection, You belong here because you belong with him. When Damien arrived, his breath caught at the sight of her. He had expected nerves, maybe even second thoughts. But what he saw was a woman who carried herself with grace, her quiet strength shining brighter than any diamond. You look breathtaking, he said, offering his arm. At the Grand Plaza Hotel, cameras flashed as they stepped out of his car. The red carpet was lined with reporters, and Damien was immediately recognized. "Mr. Grayson, over here. Who's your date tonight?" Sierra's cheeks burned under the flashes, but Damien held her hand tightly, his smile unwavering. "This is Sierra James," he announced proudly. "She's with me." Inside, the ballroom glittered with chandeliers, gold-trimmed place settings, and the low hum of orchestral music. Waiters glided between tables, carrying trays of champagne. Sierra felt like she had stepped into another universe. Every head turned as they walked in, whispers trailing behind them. Damien led her through introductions, presenting her to men in tailored suits and women in gowns worth fortunes. Some were polite, though their curiosity was barely concealed. Others were less gracious, their eyes sweeping over her simple dress, their smiles thin. Robert, Damien's CFO, gave a polite nod. His wife, however, leaned closer and whispered, "Is this your first gala, dear?" The tone was sugary sweet, but carried the sting of condescension. Sierra smiled politely, refusing to shrink. "It is." "Quite the spectacle," she replied. Damien squeezed her hand beneath the table, pride swelling in his chest. For years, he had brought women who knew how to charm this crowd with rehearsed grace. But none had ever disarmed him the way Sierra did by being unapologetically real. Dinner passed, speeches were made, and the auction began. Exotic trips, rare wines, luxury car-items bid on with sums Sierra could hardly comprehend. Yet when she leaned close and asked softly, "How much of this actually goes to the children?" Damien froze. He had never asked that question himself. Her words struck him like a pebble against glass, cracking the polished illusion of the evening. Later, as they swayed on the dance floor to a slow waltz, he murmured, "You've changed how I see everything, Sierra." But their moment didn't last. Victoria Chambers, a board member with ambitions of her own, interrupted with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She pulled Damien aside under the guise of introducing him to the governor. When Sierra stepped onto the terrace for air, Victoria followed. "You don't belong here," Victoria said coolly. "Damien has responsibilities you can't understand." This, she gestured at the glittering ballrooms as in his world, "and one day, he'll realize it. Do yourself a favor and leave before you're the one who gets hurt." When Damien returned minutes later, Sierra was gone. Her seat was empty, her champagne glass untouched. His phone buzzed a message from her. "Had to leave. Thank you for including me." His chest tightened with panic and fury. He knew who had driven her away. Damien left the gala in a rush, ignoring Robert's protests and the curious stares of investors. Outside, the cold night air did nothing to cool the fire in his chest. He tried calling Sierra, but every attempt went to voicemail. He drove to the community garden, then to Pine Haven, but she wasn't there. Finally, he called Maya, Sierra's sister. "What did you do?" she demanded, once she heard his frantic tone. "Nothing, at least. I don't think I did. We danced, we kissed, and then I was pulled away. When I came back, she was gone." Victoria spoke to her. Maya sighed heavily. "That explains it. My sister doesn't scare easily, but she hates feeling like she's being judged. And I'm guessing this Victoria woman made her feel exactly that. She told her she doesn't belong," Damien admitted bitterly. "Well," Maya replied, "if you mean what you've been saying about Sierra, then you better prove Victoria wrong." She gave him Sierra's address, and Damien drove there immediately. When Sierra opened her apartment door, she looked tired, her eyes swollen from tears. She was still in her gown, though the glamour of the night had faded. "Damien, it's late," she whispered. "I had to see you," he said, his voice raw. "Please let me in. Inside, he didn't waste time. I don't care what Victoria said. You belong with me, Sierra. Tonight proved it more than ever. Sierra's voice trembled. Damien, everyone was staring at me like I was a mistake. And Victoria, she said the board expects you to marry someone like her. That'll only hold you back. Victoria doesn't decide my life, Damien said firmly. The board doesn't decide who I love. Her eyes widened at the word, and he realized he had spoken it aloud for the first time. But he didn't take it back. I love you, Sierra. You've given me more honesty, more warmth, than anyone in my world ever has. I don't want anyone else. Her tears fell freely then, not from fear, but from the weight of his words. I love you too, she admitted softly. They held each other as if afraid the world might tear them apart. Neither knew that the real storm was only beginning. The next morning, a headline screamed from the business section of the city paper. Grayson heir involved with father's caretaker conflict of interest amid corporate crisis. The article, fed by Hamilton, painted Sierra as a manipulator using her position to gain influence. Photos of her and Damien at the gala, and even one of them at the care home, were splashed across the page. Sierra felt the ground vanish beneath her. At Pinehaven, whispers followed her. At work, some colleagues avoided her, while others defended her fiercely. Damien, meanwhile, stormed into the boardroom, his anger barely restrained. You crossed a line, he told Hamilton coldly. You dragged an innocent woman into your schemes. Hamilton only smirked. If she wanted to avoid scrutiny, perhaps she should have stayed in her lane. You, of all people, should know appearances matter. Damien's jaw tightened. When this is over, you'll regret ever saying her name. But even as he fought, tragedy struck again. That evening, William suffered a second stroke. It was worse than the first. For hours, Sierra and Damien sat by his bed, their hands entwined, whispering encouragement. When William briefly woke, his lips formed two words that changed everything. Love her. Damien's throat tightened as he kissed his father's frail hand. I do, Dad. I swear I do. And for Sierra, those words were enough. Enough to fight the world if she had to.